have a wake up with me yesterday, I finished editing Jedi Mind Trick number 11, and I must say it came out really good. I really like it. And it's a great way to start integrating the other fandoms I like. Let's go ahead and start this. Make sure the sound's working. Looks good, looks good. Okay. This is when you don't have the range advantage, but you were the preflop aggressor.
Now that you know how to play when we have a range advantage, when we're generally in good shape, let's discuss how to play when you do not have the range advantage. This is going to be when you are not in great shape. When figuring out if you should continuation bet, remember, you want to ask, how often should I be betting? And what size should I be using? So our frequency and our size. And let's first discuss frequency, then we're going to discuss size. So our frequency is determined by the hand type's flowchart. And as the preflop raiser, without the range advantage, you can only bet with premium made hands and draws. And remember, when we are betting right here, we want our premium hands to be in a ratio to our draws, one premium hand, 33%, to two draws, 67%, with 67% being the most draws we can possibly have in that ratio, but fewer is fine. And we want to make sure our marginal made hands to junk ratio is about 70-30. And again, more marginal made hands is fine because we want the...
This is, again, when after the flop comes up. So, and it's easy to remember because, like, two unpaired cards would make a pair 33% of the time. So it's easy to remember to bet those. And then your draws, you're going to be betting 67% of the time when you improve in some kind of way.
These two stronger portions of our range, the made hand portions of our range, to generally be as strong as they possibly can. But when we don't have the range advantage, they're usually going to be quite weak. So you want to strive to have these ratios. And you're going to find that you pretty much can always end up with these ratios, assuming you start with reasonable preflop ranges. The issue is, a lot of people don't start with reasonable preflop ranges. If they play way too many junky hands preflop, like let's say they raise the button with 80% of hands instead of 50% of hands, they are naturally going to end up with way too much junk. And that's going to make these ratios out of proportion, and that's going to result in you having to make concessions post-flop, and that's not going to end up working out well for you at all. That's why it's important to start with reasonable hands. So anyway, this is what we want to be doing. If we go over here to the range advantage flowchart, remember, at this point, we are way down here at the bottom, right? These are the scenarios where we do not have the range advantage. And we're going to be betting with only our premium made hands and our draws, right? When we have the range advantage, we get to bet with a wider portion of our range, or with a larger portion of our range. When we are weak, though, we must do a lot of checking, and that's going to be us betting only our premium made hands and draws. Now, for size, understand that the bet size is not purely determined by the stack depth, but it is impacted by it. As a preflop raiser with no range advantage, when we are betting, we're going to want to be using a big size. Again, take a look at the range advantage flowchart. Range advantage. Well, look at sizing, range advantage. Do we have the range advantage? No. Therefore, when we are going to be betting, we're going to be betting large. Now, what is large, right? In this scenario, large is usually about 50% to 100% pot. And as we are deeper stacked, we want to be choosing the larger bet size, like 100% pot. And as we are shallower stacked, we want to be betting smaller, usually something like 50% pot. That said, if we happen to be really short stacked, we could consider just going all in. But we'll be discussing that later when we get to the short stacked section. For now, realize that say you raise to two big blinds and the big blind calls, and the flop comes, whatever, 9-7-5. They check. If we bet here, we're going to be betting very polarized, right? Only premium made hands and draws. And when we bet, we're going to be betting quite big, usually 80% pot or something like that. If we were even deeper stacked, like 100 big blind, maybe we bet even bigger, 90% pot or 100% pot. Just to confirm, 80% pot in this scenario, you can figure it out very quickly. Our two big blind raise, the big blind's two big blind call, the big blind ante, and the small blind is 2, 2, and 1.5. So that is 5.5 big blinds in the pot. 80% of that is roughly 4 big blinds. So this is a spot where you're going to want the continuation bet about 4 big blinds. But If we were in a different scenario, let's say we had the range advantage, we'd want to be using a different size, right? But when we do not have the range advantage, it's pretty easy to figure out how much you want to bet. Usually you want to be betting pretty large, 50, 60, 70, 80% pot whenever you're playing in most tournament scenarios where you're not super deep stacked. And that's going to work out pretty well for you.
And remember, we're talking about on the flop, so the idea is when we don't have the range advantage, we should be having hands that are wildly improved by the flop that, for value. So, being in the big blind, somebody else is going to have the range advantage, but we're going to have the nut advantage. So therefore, on this board, you have, 9-7-5. It's very easy for you to have 8-6, but, you could reasonably bet big with any 9, really, like 9-10, 9-8 for sure. Even 9-6 is great because it's the same gut shot. Any, bottom 2 pair, 7-5, you could just straight up go ahead and, lead at that pretty big. And then somebody with 1 pair, might end up paying you if you have 2 pair or more, or they may end up raising their hand and you find out right where you're at, going from there. If you are the pre-flop raiser without the range advantage, should you ever bet with all hands in your range? I mean, you don't really have, no. There's no, you don't have the range advantage, so you should never be betting with all the hands in your range, because when somebody has the range advantage, they can have everything. If somebody raises pre-flop and we call, no matter from what position, more than likely we do not have aces, kings, queens, ace, king, ace, queen suited, things like that. Those hands are no longer in our range. So when the board comes out ace, 5, 4, betting that would be insane if it's checked to us, because how do we have all of this board, right? I mean, we could definitely have an ace, but that's pretty much it. Or a set, I guess. Preflop raiser do not have the range advantage. You should typically use polarized betting strategy with larger sizes. Yes. Yeah, because you're making statements. You're saying, I didn't have a great hand pre-flop, but now on this flop, I'm doing good. All right, easy first introduction there. I think we can finish this whole section about not having the range advantage today. This playing without the range advantage.
Let's take a look at a few examples as the pre-flop raiser without the range advantage. So these are going to be boards that are not particularly great for you as the pre-flop raiser. Let's take a look at 9-7-5 first. So we raise under the gun +1, big blind calls, flop comes 9-7-5, big blind checks. All right, let's go through and naturally categorize our hands first. That's going to be such that our premium hands are sets, overpairs, strong top pairs, and then our marginal made hands are going to be hands like weaker top pairs, middle pairs, bottom pairs, these under pairs here, strong ace highs. And now we want to start looking at the rest of our strategy. What draws do we actually have on this board? Well, we have 10-8 suited, Jack 10 suited, right? Those are very obvious draws. But then it's actually kind of hard to come up with too many other ones. I mean, I guess we have Ace 8, King 8, and Ace 6 for gut shots. But even then, that's not very many combinations of draws, so we have to find additional ones. And it turns out those are going to be the hands that have 2 overcards that lack showdown value the most. And that's going to be roughly all of these overcards that are not ace high. And then also the ace 10, because ace 10 has backdoor straight draw and 2 overcards. And if you use that ratio, turns out we are at roughly this 2-to-1 ratio. However, one thing I do in this scenario is I actually check aces and kings. You're going to find that when you completely lack the range advantage and the nut advantage, very often you want to be slow playing some of your absolute best hands that don't mind, or they don't need protection, right? Which is why we want to be betting more often with the lower overpairs and perhaps betting a little bit less often with the strong or checking more often with the strong overpairs. So I think this is fine. If you want to just bet all overpairs for simplicity, I would have no problem with that. But understand that we're going to be doing a lot of checking in these scenarios. And when we're doing a lot of checking, we must protect our checking range as much as possible.
Hey, thanks for the
for that reason, I usually like this ratio, marginal made hand to junk, to be to have more than 70% marginal hands to the junk in this scenario. Notice here we have like 82 or something like that. One other thing I want to point out is that 9-8 suited is a top pair with a gut shot. Now, I understand that this may appear like a marginal made hand, right? Marginal made hand with a draw. And to be fair, it is. However, one thing I've found from studying the solver extensively is that top pair with a gut shot is almost always bet, even if it has a bad kicker. So that is going to be a corner case that I would recommend you remember. It's something that I did not always do in the past, but you're going to find top pair with a gut shot.
Asked if I was pace side. I believe it. I'm slowly taking poker serious. Got a tourney in VR at 3. Got a tourney in VR at 3. Like a virtual reality tournament? That's crazy. I've seen the VR things. Oh, a tournament in VR. Oh, okay. Cool. Well, that's interesting. I've seen Tonka play the VR shit. It's really kind of fun to watch. I don't know if I could play a whole tournament like that, though. Like, 8 hours. Like, that's crazy. But, yeah, it seems fun.
Is usually thought to be a pretty strong hand, at least the solver thinks it is, and it bets that hand pretty much every time. And for that reason, I would recommend you bet it as well. So you're going to want to be betting your best top pairs and your top pairs that have gut shots, especially good gut shots. Like if we had 9-6 here, the solver may or may not bet that, but it would definitely bet with 9-8. And if you look at this natural breakdown, after I've tinkered with it a little bit, you see that our ratios are pretty nice, right? They're still in balance. They're still fine. We could bet all of our...
Looks like 150 signed up for this one. I'm shooting for 5th to 8th place. No, you're not. Every tournament, here's my absolute true belief, and I play tournaments full time. If I'm entering a tournament where I don't think I can win, I don't enter. So try to get it in your head that every tournament you enter, you're trying to win. Your level of skill does not determine your placing. Okay? You have to get lucky to win tournaments. Your level of skill can guarantee that you go further, that you last longer, but you can't guarantee your placing. So you can't say, oh, I wanted 8th place or 5th place, but I only got 9th place or 10th place. Or you can win the tournament and play like garbage. You know what I'm saying? You can make all the wrong calls and win the tournament. So you should always be shooting for first place. That is your goal. Because here's the problem. I used to have that attitude of like, man, if I just get like 5th place in this thing, that'll be a great score. You know what I'm saying? But the problem is when I would get to 5th, I found myself like relaxing. And I had to start realizing I have to push those thoughts out of my head and go, no, the game's still on. It's still very intense. And then I would push them out. And then when I started doing that, I would start winning tournaments. And that's where the real money is. Yeah, you always want to be, every tournament you enter, somebody says, how do you think you'll do? I'm going to win. Every time I've given that answer.
Over pairs, I have no problem with that. We could maybe check a few more draws.
For me, it also allows me to assess honestly if I should be playing today. Any tips for my first VR tournament? I don't know what the difference is between VR tournaments and regular tournaments. Like, I imagine it's mostly the same, just the controls are different. I have no idea what a 3-star player means. Is that 3 out of 5? Is that 3 out of 10? How are we ranking this? Oh, does SharkScope do that? Do they do the star thing? I think SharkScope has that rating, player, and all like that. My best tips, man, for any tournament is you're probably playing too many hands pre-flop. If anybody asks me what they're ever doing wrong, you're playing too many hands. Rank players out of 10 for my personal brain meter. Oh, okay. Well, don't think of it like that, man. I mean, I think it's very hard to concrete rank somebody. I mean, Fedor Holtz has gone on, 60 tournament losing streaks, live tournaments, and Jamie Gold won the World Series one year. So there is no, you know what I'm saying? Like, you can get to a certain level of skill, but don't try to concrete rank yourself, because that'll also limit you. That's really the problem with like thinking about how good you are, is that you think you're only that good. You don't know. Like, there's a lot of times where I'm sitting there playing and I'm like, whoa, I am playing way over my head. And then I'll realize, wait a minute, no, I can play better than this. What am I talking about? You know what I'm saying? And I can just keep going. So you don't want to rank yourself, because I think that limits your perception of what you can do. You know what I'm saying? You shouldn't look at any players and be like, oh, he's a better player. Fuck him. I paid my entry just like him, and if he's better than me, I'll find out. You know.
Felt inclined, that would up our junk, but that's probably fine, especially if we're checking like ace 10 type hands. Understand, when you check ace 10 in this scenario and your opponent bets the turn, when you get a blank, you probably just need to fold. So it's not really a marginal made hand at this point. It would end up being folded, kind of like we'd fold these low ace x suited. Notice we don't bet the low ace x suited. If you wanted to bluff them, I think it's acceptable, right? But I think you'd rather just have 2 overcards than 1 overcard in this spot. And if you do check it down with the ace 4, kind of like if you check it down with the ace 10, you actually win at the showdown a decent amount of the time. Okay? Let's take a look at what Solver does. Solver checks 45% of the time here. I was checking a little bit more, 47, so basically the same. Notice our equity here is quite low, 52%. I realize we still have an advantage. We're more than 50, but this is basically a neutral scenario. So let's take a look at what the solver is betting. Solver is betting the majority of the weaker overpairs, like I recommended, checking some of the higher overpairs, sure. Betting most of the good top pairs. Notice that 9-8, like I said, bets virtually every time. The gut shots bet virtually every time. Interestingly enough, 10-8 does not actually bet all that often, and I'm sure that's because it doesn't want to bet and get raised. But
yeah, that's an interesting concept that I kind of adopted in the last year, of not always betting the good draws, especially like flush draws and open-end straight draws and stuff like that. Like when you've raised pre-flop and you just happen to flop the open-ender, sometimes it's better to check those, because you end up killing your equity when you bet and the other player hit top pair and then he makes this massive bet. Like on a 9-7-8, or 9-7-5, if you're sitting there with 10-8, it's sometimes good just to check those. And you can actually, in those scenarios, there's a lot of cases for check raising. Because then players are sitting, they go, fuck, maybe this guy opened it with a pair of 9s and now he's got a set or whatever. Or they just give up a weak 9, like 9-10 or, whatever, if they're in the big blind. But there is a general thing for c-betting most flops, so we'll see what Jonathan says.
Again, for simplicity, I think it's fine to just bet that. Notice Jack 10 bets every time. These various overcards with backdoor flush draws bet pretty frequently. King 10 offsuit and Jack 10 offsuit bet. I noticed I bet those I didn't have King 10, but I did bet those if I had it. King Queen bets as well. So that's all pretty good to see. And I understand that the solver is betting like Ace Queen and Ace King sometimes, but to be playing a more implementable strategy, basically I'm just taking all these Ace Kings and betting the King Queens instead. And I'm taking all the Ace Queens and betting all the King Jacks instead. And that's going to result in you having roughly the same ratios, the same frequencies as the solver in terms of betting and checking, but it's going to be way more implementable for you.
The concept there is a little bit interesting too, because like this is the scenario where you've raised, the flop comes out bad, you don't have the range advantage or the nut advantage, but you have a good hand like Ace King or Ace Queen. You can just check those. Because the hand does have value. I just played one 2 days ago that's going to end up in a YouTube video where this player 3-bet me pre-flop. I had the Ace King, I was on the button, and I was on the cutoff, and I decided not to 4-bet. So technically our range is pretty muted, but the flop came out just all garbage, and it was like Jack 4-5. I remember it now. It was Jack 4-3. He checked, so I checked back, and there was no reason to bet there because he's 3-betting me with, good pairs. He's 3-betting me with, Ace Kings, Ace Queens, all that kind of stuff. So I'm either way ahead or way behind. So we go check, flop. The turn is another Jack. So now it's like Jack 4, 5, whatever. And it goes check again. Or sorry, on the turn, he bets. And now it's like, why are you betting? Like if he had an overpair, Queens, Kings, Aces, he would have bet that on the flop. Just for whatever. But then the Jack comes off, and I'm supposed to believe that he has a Jack in his hand that he wouldn't bet on the flop, but he would bet when he makes trips. This makes no sense. So I called it, and the river came off, and he made a big bet. And the hand has such value that I'm sitting there going, unless this guy flopped like a set of Jacks and turned quads, there's really no reason for him to be 3-betting here and betting this way. So I made the snap call, and he had Ace Queen. And it's just one of those interesting ones where the Ace Kings and Ace Queens have so much showdown value that without the range advantage, you can check a lot and realize that you actually have a good hand, even though you didn't improve. That's why instead of checking the king Queen, and the King Jack, you bet those because you have less showdown value. You know what I'm saying? It's better to take the showdown value with the ace high than the king high, obviously.
Notice these low ace X suiteds don't bet a ton. Ace 10 suited actually doesn't bet a ton either, but again, to try to be implementable, it's probably better just to bet it. And the ratios come out pretty nice, so I like this. Also notice the solver typically picks a bigger bet size here, 2/3 pot, and I think that's going to be something we see across the board in these scenarios where we lack the range advantage. All right, now let's take a look at this one. We raise button, big blind calls. So now we have a much wider range. Let's just go through and naturally break down the hands again. Notice now we're just betting all the overpairs. I think that's fine. Like I said, I don't think it's all that important if you mix up the overpairs or don't mix up the overpairs. But I think when you're under the gun, you want to do a little bit more checking. When you're on the button, you want to do a little bit more betting. Just because your range is just substantially wider in these scenarios. So categorize the hands, right? Good top pairs and better, we are betting. Straights we're betting. Like we see the 9-8 here we're betting. If you wanted to bet 9-6, it's probably fine. So that all makes logical sense. Marginal made hands. Well, first, why don't we do this? Why don't we go through and select all of our obvious draws first? Obvious draws here are all the 8s, all the 6s, right? Jack 10 for gut shot. 6-4 for open-ended straight draw. And then I selected these additional hands because they clearly have a decent chunk of equity, but they lack showdown value very much, right? I would definitely bet Queen Jack over a hand like Queen 2 because Queen 2 does not have 2 overcards, doesn't have backdoor straight draw, right? So these hands are just going to count as junk here. And notice if we do that, we select all of our good premium hands and all of these logical bluffs, we end up already at this 2-to-1 ratio, right? Okay, so now let's go through and try to categorize everything else. Marginal made hands. These are going to be all of our jacks. I'm sorry, all of our 9s that we have remaining. This is going to be all of our 7s, all of our 5s, all of our underpairs that are better than 5s. 4s, 3s, 2s count as junk. To be fair, like say the turn is something like a 2 and your opponent bets the turn and you have pocket 4s, it kind of gets upgraded to a marginal made. They can call the turn and then fold the river. So it's not like these hands are total junk. Kind of like ace 4, right? If you turn an ace on the turn, if you turn an ace, then an ace 4 is clearly very good. Or if you turn a 4, it's at least acceptable, right? So it's not like these are always going to be junk. But most of the time on the turn, if your opponent bets, you're probably just going to end up folding. So all of these hands, no 2 overcard hands. The hands that only have 1 overcard or no overcards. These are all going to be pretty weak, I think. So I think that makes logical sense. Notice I have King, Queen, King, Jack, King 10 listed as marginal. And I think that this is kind of like, again, sort of a loose categorization, but you should be way more inclined to call a turn bet with 2 various overcards because they have more outs than a hand like ace 4. And
again, you also have more showdown value with a hand like King Jack than Queen Jack. So I'm saying it's better to bet the Queen Jack than it is the King Jack if you need to choose, because you're going to win more times in a showdown when it just goes check, 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 check. You know what I'm saying? With the King Jack, because you have King High versus Queen High. Simple thing like that.
You're not necessarily calling because you are going to check it on the river. You're calling because sometimes you're going to get there on the river and sometimes you're going to be able to bluff on the river. So I do plan on calling the turn bet a lot of time with these 2 overcard type hands. That said, these may end up being junk. And notice this is 48 combinations of hands. So if we move 48 from marginal to 40 to junk here, we'd end up with 180 to 150. So now we're way out of balance here, right? So whenever you see that happen, you do need to try to categorize your hands such that you get a 70-30 ratio, which is roughly what we have here. But that means you need to stick to it. You need to generally try to call the turn with a lot of these hands that are actually kind of junky when it goes check, check on the flop, because otherwise we're drastically overfolding to our opponent on the turn. And to be fair, when it does go check, check on the flop, I don't hate the idea of overfolding a little bit on the turn because this is a spot that's good for your opponent. Whenever you get a board that's just bad for you, you should be giving up more often than not. But I think this is roughly what I'm doing in this scenario. Notice if we have like ace 4 backdoor draw and we turn a backdoor draw, we're going to call, right? So again, these overcards and these low aces are kind of a loose categorization, but I think this works out pretty nice. Notice we are pretty balanced. Notice we're checking a pretty good amount of the time. What is this? I always can't do math whenever 7 plus 6. 50-something% of the time, is that right? 40, 55, yeah, 50-something% of the time, 53% of the time. Solver, hey, look at that. Checks 53% of the time. Sometimes it works out great, huh? Overpairs all bet here. right? So all the made hands are betting. Notice 9-6 bets every time. Notice I did not have it as a bet, but certainly could have. So notice here that like 9-6 bets more than 10-9 and 9-8 bets more than 10-9, so that's good to see. Notice solver uses big size on average, which means you should probably just use a big size across the board. Jack 10 bets every time, or the majority of the time. Notice Queen Jack and Queen 10 sometimes bet, but often check.
Yeah, I really don't like what he said about betting big. You know, you're betting big 30% of the time, betting, you know, small one third, you know, 15% of the time. I really kind of, on these spots, if I'm going to bet it, I really like the bigger bet much more than the smaller bet, because you're going to be betting less frequently. You're going to be betting less streets with your bluffs. Like, you're not going to 3-barrel off, you know, 10 jack here, most likely. So when you are going to bet, you're taking a big shot to make a big statement, to be polarized. So I like bigger bets here a lot. These are what I call kill pots, where you make the big bet and just try to end the pot as quickly as possible. And it doesn't have to be oversized, but, you know, 2/3 pot, somewhere around there is fine. Never 50% pot in these scenarios. I know it seems close, but it's not, especially at the less than $100 buy-in tournament level. If you're betting 50% pot, I'm only seeing those bets from people who really don't know what they're doing, and they're just trying to bet something. Your bet should be polarized. 1/3, 2/3 on the flop is way more profitable than betting 50%, because 50% just doesn't make a stand. It's too middle of the road, and your opponent can call it and have to be right so infrequently, you know, that it's fine, and it doesn't put any implication in there. Like, if you bet a third pot, yeah, your opponent can call it more often and it is profitable, but he has to have that in the back of his head of, why are you betting a third pot? What are you not protecting? Did you flop a set? Like, it puts all those dynamics in there because you've made it so cheap for them. Then when the turn comes out and they check and you bet bigger, well, now they're going to sit there and not going to like it too much, and that's how you set up a bet, where you then jam the river, and you'll see a bunch of stuff like that. And the latest video that I just made, I just posted it last night on the YouTube, actually shows kind of a mindset thing and what you're looking for in betting, and it was done in a really fun way. I actually really liked the video.
Jack. What draws does the solver use instead? That's what I want to be looking at. Random Jack 4, Jack 3, and 10-4 backdoor draw. Yeah, good luck figuring that one out. Ace 2 offsuit, right? So solver picks somewhat random hands in these scenarios. Again, to just be implementable, you should probably just try to probably just bet your better draws in reality. Notice 10-8 also does not bet every time, which is interesting. You're going to find that your absolute best draws, or the draws you really don't want to get raised with, often will check. And with 40 big blinds, that may be the case. You certainly don't want to bet like 4 or 5 big blinds and they get jammed on, because then you have to fold the 10-8, right? Whereas if you bet 5 big blinds with king 6 and get jammed on, you just fold, right? No problem.
See, that's a scenario with the 10-8 where if I was going to bet it, which isn't going to be very often, because like you said, you don't want to get bet off your draw, I am going to bet smaller, just because it's going to be a frequency bet. So if it's the kind of player who, you know, you just have to bet twice against them and they fold, or maybe they're a little bit more passive than other players post-flop, then betting 1/3 pot is fine, because you're going to be betting that player at a greater frequency. Then they call, and even if you miss the draw on the turn, you can bet bigger. And then, you know, if they call, you can bet, and you have the bailout. You have the bailout of, you know, the straight, you know, can be good for you. But most of the time, you're just up against the 9. So, like, when, you know, queen or king or ace hits or something like that, or even when the board pairs like a 7 or a 5, or you run out a backdoor possible flush, it's the kind of thing where because of the cards you have that your opponent can't have, meaning a 10 and an 8, it makes it less likely he's on a draw. So when cards like an 8 come off, it's more likely to improve your hand than your opponent's hand, because they're less likely to have hands like, you know, what is that, like 8-6 or 10-7 or things like that. So it just makes it better to set up bets in that scenario. That being said, though, that's only if I'm going to bet them and it's versus a specific player. It's not going to be very often, though. I mean, it just should be checked mostly because of the hand's intrinsic value for draw.
Wonder if there's any sort of patterns we can find here with these low junky hands. Like, maybe we'll find that all the hands that are on the very cusp of our range, maybe those just are often used as bluffs. Maybe we'll see more of that as we go. But look, I'm telling you, I don't think you need to focus on these specific junky bluffing hands in these spots, and I would instead just try to play a somewhat implementable strategy like I'm doing here. Anyway, though, our ratios line up pretty nicely where we have really the exact same proportion of hands as the solver does, which is good. All right, re-raise under the gun +1, button calls, flop comes 9-7-5. Again, categorize the hands. When we raise under the gun, I think we do want to do a little bit more slow playing with the aces and kings in these situations. And we are betting with all of our top pairs, right? Or the majority of them. Betting sets. And now, because we're out of position, again, remember you want to have probably fewer draws than if you are in position when you are betting. So we have a 1-to-1 ratio here. Notice we actually have a lot of junk. I think we should probably take a little bit of junk here and probably add it to the draw range if I was remaking this image. What would I like to bet? I guess these backdoor draws is what I would like to add. Some of these backdoor draws. That would make logical sense. King, Jack, I mean, I guess sure. King, Queen, I guess sure. Because when we check King, Queen out of position, we probably just have to fold, right? So I think it would actually be reasonable to bet these hands sometimes. That would clear up this problem. That said, when you're out of position on a board that's just not good for you, then you lose, right? Notice also if you bet all of your overpairs, you're going to end up with even more premium made hands, which is kind of a problem, right? We don't want to have more premium made hands. Whenever you need more marginal hands, an easy solution to this is to check more of your premium made hands if you feel inclined. That said, the other solution is to take junk and add it to the draws. But when you're out of position, you want...
You got to have some check folds. Well, he's not saying you don't have check folds. That's why you're checking your junk. You know what I'm saying? Those are the junk hands are the check folds easily. Some of the marginal made hands are going to be check folds as well. But you'd be surprised, Maz, how often you can call on the flop with these marginal made hands that he's talking about. Like, and he's got, you know, ace jack in there. He's got ace 7 in there. He's got ace queen in there. You know, you got to understand that there are reasons to call there because of the removal and blockers that you have. He was saying bet king queen and king jack rather than check fold. No. You missed that one. What he was saying was the king jack with the backdoor flush draw is more likely to bet than the king queen because of the running straight draws that make it so much easier. I heard what he was saying there. He said that most of the time when you're out of position with king queen, you're just going to have to check fold. He did say that line. But what do you think are the best check folds here? Best check folds here for me are obviously just the trash and hands that are going to get you into a shitload of trouble. You know, things like, you know, the ace, the bottom suited aces, obviously, because oh, that's weird. My watch just went off. The bottom suited aces, obviously, because you can get into a lot of trouble. Like, you know, if you have the ace 4 suited, there's going to be a lot of times you're going to hit, you know, the 6 on the turn, and you're now picking up an open ender, but you could absolutely be drawing dead. You know, things like that. That being said, I'd probably check call with it on the flop, looking for the spade draw. If I was, you know, ace 4 spades, you know, things like that. The ace can cause problems, but it can also solve problems, believe it or not, because, you know, when you know, you're under the gun and the button, you raised and the button calls, and you have the ace 4 in your range, you know, the button typically has less aces than you because their range is so wide. You got to remember the range you're playing against. Oh, you were mixing it up with the offsuit. Yeah. You misheard him, and I had to think about it after he said it. It was said kind of quickly. So like king queen off, king jack off are the folds, right? Where the suiteds are the calls is bet, right? That's a simple implementable way to do it, right? So it's 9 of diamonds, 7 of clubs, 5 of spades. So the diamonds, clubs, and spades, suited king queens, king jacks, you can call those. You know, calling those a draw, and you can see, you know, it's only, you know, part of this very small range of 3% of draws, and I know it's a hard concept to understand, but you have to find the draws in this scenario because you don't want to be just check calling with your monsters, you know what I'm saying, when you flop this top set or whatever, because then it just makes you so easy to play against because you're going to check, your opponent's going to bet once, and then you're going to check the turn, and you're never going to get the chance to check raise. You know what I'm saying? Also, it means that when you have the king queen or the king jack suited and you do check call and your opponent bets the turn, you can sometimes pick up on them and say, oh, this is a great spot to go ahead and check raise. That is in the new video too. There's a lot of situations where my lack of range advantage means that the board improved me so much that I have the nut advantage. So I started check raising players with literal air, just because it makes sense. Right, so you can have value bets too, right? The sets, etc. Right, the two pairs, things like that. Because there are hands like 10-9 suited that are going to open under the gun +1. I mean, that can open pretty much every stack down to 15 blinds in every position. So you're going to have 10-9 suited. So, you could be check calling with that, because you can see like 10-9 suited in this range is a marginal made hand. You are going to be checking with that, but you're not folding it, right? And if the board gives you some kind of backdoor thing like a jack or an 8, or even if you pick up a 10 or whatever like that, then you're in a situation where your marginal made hand that checked the flop turns into a hand that's going to look to check raise on the turn or river. You know what I'm saying? So it's the immediate potential versus the full backdoor. You know what I'm saying? He has mentioned the bet sizing yet. Yeah, he mentioned bet sizing. Typically, you're bet sizing when you're betting, because this is just a general rule. You're betting these infrequently. So therefore, because you're not betting often, you're typically betting bigger. You're polarized. You're either betting very small or very big, but the majority of the time, about 60% of the time, you're betting about 2/3 pot. The rest of the time, you're check. No, half pot is never good. We just talked about this. Half pot is never a bet. I'm going to tell you right now, Maz, don't bet half pot. Unless you want to get called, don't bet half pot, because players just don't understand it. And by understanding that concept, it allows you to bet half pot when you do want the call. So like if you had aces or something, you know what I'm saying, and you raised pre-flop and somebody called it, and you bet half pot and they called, you could probably bet half pot all the way down and get the majority of your chips in. And when they call you three half pots, or when they call 3 half pots bets all the way down to the river, you're going to be amazed how many times this happened to me live so many times I can't even count, where you would just go, it'd be bet, call, bet, call, bet, call. And then the guy would just look at you and you go, yeah, aces. And they would go, oh, fuck. And they would just, throw it away, because it doesn't define anything. Betting much smaller or much bigger, that's what you want. And I love my bets being polarized. I want to say something when I bet. Half pot says I made a bet. That's all it says. It doesn't inform anything about the hand.
You want to be doing a lot of checking, right? So because you want to be doing a lot of checking out of position, you often want to be strengthening your checking range as opposed to adding more premium hands or draws to your betting range, because you do want to be checking a lot, especially on boards that are not great for you. So here I ended up betting 65% of the time. And what does Solver do? Solver bets... I checked 65. Solver checks 53. So Solver was betting a little bit more often. What was it picking to bluff with? King, queen every once in a while, ace, queen every once in a while, ace, king sometimes, low ace X suited sometimes. So you see, again, whenever you see this very, very mixed...
See, and you can see here, like, it is because we're out of position, we're checking the majority of the time, and what's left, because we have hands that aren't improved by this board, but our range is so strong pre-flop that we're betting 1/3 pot, twice as much as 2/3 pot, because of the simple fact that we're going to be betting at a higher frequency, meaning more often. You do it more often, you're going to make smaller bets. You do it less often, you're going to make bigger bets.
Strategy. Obviously, no human's going to be able to implement this, which is why, again, I don't even think you necessarily need to be looking at it too much. You want to make sure your percentages line up kind of close to the solver, and we're off by 10% here, but that's probably okay. Notice our equity is not good at all, which is why we're checking a pretty good amount of the time. But I think this strategy here is pretty nice implementable. Notice our betting range for value. It's just like over pairs and good top pairs, and that's mostly what solver does too. So good, right? In general, I think the most important thing is make sure you have the value hands right, and then just add in some number of bluffs that make the ratios appropriate. And here, like I said, I think we probably could find a few more bluffs. If you told me you want...
That's funny, because that's what I tend to do. When I think about these spots, I tend to say, okay, because the value hands are easy to figure out, right? It's what's improved by this board. It's what doesn't worry about this board. Hands like, the big pairs, stuff like that. I do like this concept that I'm just now getting comfortable with checking the aces and kings and throwing those in the marginal made hand column, because they don't require much protection. I'm saying, if you have queens, an ace, a king can come off. If you have jacks, a queen can come off. So you want to be betting those for protection, and those are going to be slightly larger bets. But the aces and kings aren't really worried about, getting beat simply. And yes, you're going to get beat by straights and flushes and things like that, by when you check and it checks back and the guy just happens to luck into something. But if you're trying to protect against a 4-card hand or more, you're protecting too widely. You're really only protecting your one pair hands versus other one pair hands. You know what I'm saying? So like, if you can get beat by one pair of cards, then you're in a position you need to bet. But aces and kings can't be beat by one pair very, very easily. Aces needs to be beaten by 2 pair or better. So because of that concept, the player only has 6 outs against you if they have no pair. So therefore, why would you bet it? You know what I'm saying? That's the general concept. So then you would check it and then bet turn and river. You get 2 streets of value,
Want to take some junk and add it to draws, I think that's certainly acceptable. Solver seems to agree because it was betting a little bit more often. So like if I had to remake this image based on what I've just looked at from the solver here, I would definitely just bet more of these low ace-x suiteds. Again, I made all these images before I looked at the solver, so this is just natural JL sitting down thinking about this spot, right? So I'm not always going to be...
Yeah, natural JL has done this thousands of times, so don't think that that's something that's easy to come up with. He looks at the solver and goes, oh, I was right. When rest of us go look at the solver and go, okay, I missed this, I missed that, that makes sense. Okay, I understand. He's basically checking his work from hundreds of thousands of times being in the scenario.
Perfect. And that's, we're not always going to be perfect, so we have to do our best. But you see, we're still coming up with something pretty reasonable. And like I said, if you come up with something pretty reasonable the majority of the time, you're going to be way ahead of the vast majority of people you play against. Really, almost everyone you're going to play against. And I think this is nice. Nice and also implementable. Maybe like King Jack wants to bet, low ace-x suitors want to bet, but I think the strategy is quite good and usually going to be fine. Fine and going to work out well enough for you.
See, and we're defining the edges. You know what I'm saying? Like, these are basically the cutoff points, like where we go from a marginal hand that we're checking, like ace-queen or ace-king, because we do have showdown value, but we don't have a great hand. We can improve. We do have draws, but they're not quite bad enough to put in a pure draw category, so we can call them a made hand. And we're defining the edge being ace-10 and king-jack, king-queen. So, there are times when king-queen is going to want to bet, but it could very easily be checked just like ace-jack or ace-queen. So, interesting little, you want to define the edges of your range, not the vast majority, Under the gun +1 versus the big blind. Here's the flop. You should bet more frequently with ace-ace or 10-10. Well, 10-10. This is what we were talking about. The 10-10 needs more protection because it can be beat by a jack, a queen, or a king, or an ace on the turn. So, derp. When you're playing in position versus the button, and this is the flop, should you typically bet larger or smaller compared to when you're out of position? Well, when you're in position, you can always bet smaller. Larger, out of position. Wait. Oh, I read it backwards. Never mind. Sorry. Larger bets are more commonly used in position versus out of position. Okay, yeah. Because you're betting less frequently in or out of position than in position on this board without the range advantage. I read it backwards. I'm sorry. Under the gun versus the button on this flop. What should you do with your junk hands? Jack. I mean, it's a junk hand. That's pretty much always the answer. And you're out of position. Out of position, generally, you're just checking. For the majorities, for up to 60-70% of the time out of position, you're probably going to want to check. It also leads me to calling more pre-flop with great hands like ace-queen than it does 3-betting, depending on where the raise comes from. If the raise comes from under the gun +1 or 2, having ace-queen in the small blind, it actually becomes more powerful to just call it than it does to 3-bet it, because when you 3-bet and get action, you kind of don't know where you're at. But when you call it, you keep a wide range, and it allows you to have more bluffs later, and that ace is still pretty goddamn good when you hit it, and you can kind of determine from there. But by keeping the pot small and your range wide, you end up with a lot more opportunities to steal pots from players who actually have better hands, So I've had it happen where I've been betting for value and not realized I was bluffing doing that, and I've had players show me ace-king after I've made my moves because they didn't know how to play the ace-king for value, so I took it away from them. I thought I was value betting, but apparently I was bluffing because of their actual hand. But it's just one of those things, and that's just a very, anecdotal move that you'll see me make when I play, fairly frequently. Not crazy, not every time, but if it comes from an early position, I like calling there.
Now let's take a look at 7-4-3. This is going to be a pretty bad board for under the gun. So you raise under the gun +1, big blind calls, 7-4-3, 2 hearts, big blind checks. So in this scenario, you definitely cannot bet 100% of the time, even though the board is kind of uncoordinated. And that's because the big blind has a lot of marginal made hands and also some just super nut hands in this scenario that under the gun +1 does not have. So let's just go through and categorize our hands again, right? Premium made hands, over pairs, top pair, marginal made hands, ace highs, middle pairs, etc. And then everything else is really a draw, right? And if we go through and break down this hand range, we'll see that our ratios are fine, draw to premium. And, we could certainly use some more junk. But to be fair, some of these marginal made hands are going to end up junk on the turn. Like, say the turn's a 6, right? Then most of them end up junk, right? That said, maybe we want to strengthen our checking range a little bit. Like, if you told me we wanted to check aces and kings here, like we did on the previous 9-7-5 board, I think that's probably a good strategy. Notice that would result in our draw to premium made ratio still being well in balance.
Way more inclined to check the aces or kings if I had the ace or king of hearts in my hand. I think that's just kind of like I said, this trapping with the big pairs thing I've only implemented in the last couple months. So just not c-betting the aces, it's become really profitable for me. But when I'm looking for specific situations to check them and figure out the trap, it's usually on boards like this where I have the ace or king of hearts in my hand, because you're going to get to check raise quite often, and then you're going to check and you're going to make a big bet, and you're going to see somebody go off, with a pair and a gut shot, or maybe they have a pair and a flush draw, but it's kind of rare because what could they have? 4 or 5, you know what I'm saying, is great, but they can have I guess 4-6 as well, but there's not too many of those scenarios you're going to be in. So you're really just worried about queen high and jack high flush draws, like 10 jack, things like that. And when they check and you make this gigantic raise on the flop, meaning pot or bigger, the 10 jack suited is even going to be like, well, fuck this, I don't even know if I can win with a pair, I don't even know if my flush draw is good, so they'll just chuck it away. And that's how you end up protecting the ace king with the ace or king of hearts in your hand. Much more inclined to lead at it without the ace or king in my hand, because there is no backdoor potential.
And we would have a better protected checking range, because right here, understand, whenever you're categorizing marginal made hands, that means you're calling on the majority of turns if your opponent bets. But I don't know if that's actually true. I don't know if we're actually calling with ace-10 on the majority of turns, or ace-queen on the majority of turns. And, also importantly, you need to call with a lot of those going to the river too. You can't call with all of them on the turn and then fold all of them on the river, because then you're just going to be super exploitable. So you want to make sure you have some hands in your checking range that can very easily call turn and call river. Like when you check aces and kings on this board, you know you're calling the turn and you know you're calling the river, right? Unless it's really bad for you. Notice here I'm betting 6s and 5s. These hands are very likely best. They don't mind protection, and this is kind of similar to that 9-8 spot earlier where I was saying you should bet your top pairs with gut shots. These are pretty strong hands in this scenario, and they're vulnerable to being outdrawn, and they have a gut shot. So very often you do just want to bet with these. Made hands that are vulnerable to being outdrawn but still have loads of equity usually don't mind betting. So in this scenario, I'm checking 33%. Solver checks 30%, so we're pretty close there. Notice Solver does check the best over pairs every once in a while, not a ton though. It is betting the 7 that it has. It is betting just a smattering of bluffs here, non-showdown value bluffs, which makes a lot of sense. It's betting ace high, king high, queen high, ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 a decent chunk of the time. Oops, sorry about that. I was not betting those, so maybe I need to be betting those even more often. What was it checking? Let's try to find where Solver's checking here, because I'm kind of confused. It is checking some random 8s. So basically it's just checking some of these overcards that lack showdown value some chunk of the time, whereas I was not. And I can tell you the reason it's probably doing this. It's probably doing this so it has what's referred to as better board coverage. The solver likes to know that on various turns, it's going to be able to continue more often, right? So notice that whenever I check back on the flop here, any ace is great for me, and any other card's not particularly great. What solver's doing is instead of checking all the best showdown value hands, it's checking a smattering of these hands so that if a random king comes, it's going to have it sometimes, or a queen, or a jack, right? Because here, notice it's checking back with some king highs, checking back with some...
And that feeds into the concept of why scare cards are good to bet, because of the fact that you are going to check those, Broadway hands, And then when a jack, queen, or king comes off, it makes it pretty good for you to bet as the pre-flop raiser who checked the flop when the flop goes check, check, because that is a scare card. We just saw the mathematical reason why scare cards work is because you're going to have them, you're going to check them, and now they just became super powerful when you make a pair on the turn because it's random. You know what I'm saying? Your opponent shouldn't have too many of the kings or queens in their range because they just called. So that's kind of the mathematical representation of why scare cards work for bluffing, because you should have them.
Queen highs, checking back with some jack highs. And again, this is a strategy that's nice in theory, but it's very difficult to implement in practice. Notice solver also bets ace 4 and ace 3 a decent chunk of the time, which, again, that's that same concept of betting 6s and 5s, right? Where you're betting basically for protection. So cool spot, but notice again, our ratios are pretty much the same. When we logically outline our range, we're checking 33, solver's checking 30, so we can be pretty happy with that. By the way, our equity advantage is actually still kind of high here. Notice it's at 56%, but we do have to be careful due to lacking the range advantage. By the way, I'm lacking the nut advantage. That said, we don't lack the nut advantage by a huge amount, which is why in this spot, we're actually using a smaller size more often than not when we are betting. And that's because here, even though the opponent does have the nut advantage a little bit, they don't have too many super nut hands on this board. They have some, but not a ton. They're going to be sitting in this spot with mostly junky overcards, like 9-8 offsuit, right? So this goes back to that range connectivity idea, where the opponent's range has some small portion of hands that connect very well with this board, but also just a lot of junk. And when your opponent's range is mostly junk, but some really high equity hands, you want to be doing a lot of small bet sizing when you're betting. This is kind of like the Jack 6-6 board, right? Where you want to, when you are betting, even though you're betting somewhat frequently, you want to be betting using a small size. And this is a different scenario than 9-7-5, because on 9-7-5, the opponent's going to have a lot of hands that connect with the board very well, right? They're going to have a lot of top pairs, middle pairs, gut shots, etc.
It's the kind of thing where when the board shouldn't be good for anybody, you're going to be betting it more frequently, more often. So you're going to bet it at a smaller amount because you're making so many more bets. Because when somebody hits this board, either you or your opponent, it is smashing. This isn't a board where you're going to lightly hit this board with one pair and get into a bluff call-y kind of scenario. These are the kind of things where if you raise under the gun and the big blind calls, the big blind's either going to totally whiff this and you're going to totally whiff this, or one of you is going to have the nut flush draw or two pair or straight or a pair and a gut shot or whatever. Somebody's going to have something pretty smashing. So if that's a large possibility of the times you get called, obviously you don't want to be bloating the pot and just ending up totally screwed with no stack to pot ratio that can continue bluffing or dodge it when you get raised and a trap gets sprung. Just do it. Jesus Christ. It was so much quieter than trying to do it quietly.
Well, I was done by then.
But here they're going to have just a lot of random overcard stuff, which is why we're using a smaller size. All right. Same scenario, except for we're on the button. Think about if that should impact your bet sizing, the fact that we're on the button. What's that going to do to the big blind's calling range? Think about it for a second.
Big blind's calling range is going to be wider because they're going to be defending far more frequently versus a button open than they are versus an under the gun or under the gun +1 open, because they're aware of how strong that range is.
Here, again, just go through and categorize all your best hands. Very logical, right? Strong top pairs, pairs with gut shot, top pair with gut shots, straights, etc. Marginal made hands are going to be 4s, 3s, ace highs, under pairs, weaker top pairs, right? That makes a whole lot of sense. Notice I have ace 6 and ace 5 and king 6 categorized as a marginal made hand. That's because I'm going to check it back on the flop and then call any turn bets. I definitely think king 6 could be a draw. We betting some, checking some. Maybe this was an oversight by me. I have ace. Now let's take a look at the draws, right? We're going to look hard for draws here because we need to come up with a decent chunk of them. So the obvious draws are hands containing a 6 or a 5. Again, we're mixing it up here. Again, maybe an oversight by me. Ace 2 is a gut shot, even though it's kind of a bad gut shot. I definitely think you want to bet it. And then we have to start searching kind of hard. So I'm going to use every hand containing an 8, or at least the majority of hands containing an 8 that don't have showdown value, because they have the backdoor straight draw, right? Same thing for the 9s, like 10-9 type hands. So notice I'm using a lot of these right in here because they lack showdown value. They have 2 overcards and they have some backdoor draws. And then I'm just using every other hand that has a backdoor flush draw or a front door flush draw for the most part. Or at least the majority, some of them, right? Not all of them, some of them. As they have more showdown value, I'm typically using only the front door flush draw because you'll be able to call with a backdoor flush draw on the turn a decent amount of the time. That said, it's kind of just a mix here. I think you can really organize these hands as you see fit. I don't think it's that big of a deal if you're betting some backdoor, some front door, or both, right? As you see here, we do come up with the ratio 30 to 16, which is about 2 to 1, or 1 to 2, which is good. And then the junk is everything else. These are just a bunch of junky high card hands, etc., that are not selected. And you see all those go into the junk, and we end up with a 70-30 ratio. So this one broke down pretty nicely, despite the fact that I have a lot of random stuff in this range. So here I am checking. What is this? 36, 46, 50, 52%. Solver checks 53%. So good. Lined up right about the same. Solver bets all the 7s for the most part. Notice 7-6 and 7-5 bet. Remember I told you that corner case where you're betting top pair with a gut shot. Solver does that as well. Solver checks some 6s, checks some 5s, but it's betting for the most part with the, some of the lower showdown ones. So that's interesting. Solver bets the majority of overpairs. Interesting, ace-king is betting in this scenario. I suppose it can get called by a lot of worse hands still. And then just a lot of checking, right? But when the solver is betting, notice it's using a lot of these front door and back door flush draws in this region. It does bet ace-2 a decent chunk of the time for the gut shot. So that lines up pretty nice. All right, let's take...
Gut shot and the overcard, because when you bet that flop, your opponent is going to give up a lot of aces. So when they call and the ace hits, you can be fairly confident that you should have the only ace. Now, that being said, you don't want to pile money into the pot, but at the same time, you don't want to just check fold. You're going to be check calling, and then maybe you're going to bet a block bet on the river. Maybe you're going to check call and let them bluff the river. You know, those rag aces that come off in situations where your opponent shouldn't have them, like after you've bet the flop, can actually be great bluff catchers. So a little side note there.
Take a look at, we raise under the gun +1, and the button calls. Flop comes 7-4-3. Ooh, interesting spot. So, in this scenario, the board doesn't really connect with either player's range at all, right? 7-4-3 might as well be 3 blanks. We have a little bit of a problem, though, in that our opponent is going to have roughly 50% equity in this scenario. But if you think about the ranges, they actually probably have a few more nut hands because they're going to call with 6-5 suited, and they're going to call with pocket 7s, which we could have too. But they're also going to call with 4s and 3s, right? Whereas we're not raising 4s and 3s. So this is a spot where it's going to be like 50-50 in terms of range advantage, but we probably lack the nut advantage a little bit. So out of position, lacking the range advantage, lacking the nut advantage, even though we have aces, kings, queens, and they may not, they have the better hands, right? They have 7s, 4s, 3s, and 6-5 suited. We have 7s too again. So that cancels or doesn't matter. This is a spot where we have to proceed very, very cautiously. And we're going to be looking to check raise this board some chunk of the time. Just to put our opponent in a really rough spot with a lot of our best hands and a lot of our junky draws. So this is a spot where we're going to have to look to battle. And we're battling by playing passively. Notice that when we are betting, we're going to want to bet our overpairs that are susceptible to being outdrawn and our top set that's super nuts. We want to bet our draws that are very obvious. That's going to be ace-2, ace-6, ace-5, and then these few flush draws / backdoor flush draws. Notice we can easily check call or check raise the slightly better flush draws, right? So I think we could... we also want to stick to this like 1.5 to 1 ratio, again, because we're out of position draws to premium made hands. We don't want to have quite the 2 to 1 ratio or 1 to 2 ratio when we are out of position. You could, but you typically find that the solver doesn't like that, so I don't like it either. So I like this, though. I mean, this is an interesting scenario that's a bit of a corner case, but if you think about the ranges and how they interact, you'll realize we don't actually have any advantage in this scenario. And when you don't have any advantage and you're out of position, you want to be doing a lot of checking. This is almost as if we defended from the big blind against a preflop raiser. Our opponent's in position, they have the advantage, or it's roughly neutral, so we check everything. When you check everything, well, that's usually going to be the right strategy when you're in bad shape. And if you take a look at this, solver checks solver bets 22% of the time, so I was betting a little bit less than solver. If you wanted to add in a few more bets, perhaps you add in, a few more strong hands. But whenever I'm in a scenario like this where I know I'm checking a lot, where I know I'm supposed to check frequently, I love to strengthen my checking range because that's going to be the range that's way harder to defend. It's easy to defend with a polarized range when you're betting because you just get your money with your good hands and fold out your junk, right? Or your junky draws. Whenever you are checking, though, it's way harder to defend that appropriately on the flop and the turn and the river. We're going to be discussing turn and river strategy later. And an easy way to fix that problem is to strengthen your checking range by checking just more good, strong made hands, like overpairs in this scenario. Notice the solver just does a lot of mixing in this scenario, lots and lots of checking with all sorts of stuff. So not a ton to get from this, besides the fact that the solver actually does check a very large amount of the time. Because again, notice equity is like 50-50. And I'm telling you, we lack these super nut hands in our range, whereas our opponent has them a little bit more often. So interesting spots, but whenever you lack the advantage and you're out of position, a very clear takeaway from this is you should be checking a lot.
Pretty interesting, simple concept that I think people miss out on is the checking more. Under the gun +1 big blind. Here's the flop. Do you have the strong range advantage? I mean, technically pre-flop you had it, but not on the flop, right? Yeah. When you're playing button versus big blind, you should typically bet larger or smaller compared to when you're under the gun +1. I mean, I'm guessing on this board you're going to be betting more frequently, so you're going to bet smaller, right? Oh, no, wait a minute. Larger bet size are used. I guess that's just because your range is wider and it contains more of this board than it does under the gun +1. All right, that makes sense. When you're under the gun +1 versus the button, should you bet frequently? No. Right. You're going to be checking because you're now out of position. Or you're in position, but your range is kind of screwy here. So on this board, so yeah, all right. Market is complete. Come on. It's always interesting in the middle of the week. You see, people on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. A lot of people using the site, so it kind of slows down a little bit. Oh, we finished the section. Look at that. That was pre-flop as the pre-flop aggressor without the range advantage. Nice. I'm going to mark that as complete, and I believe the next section is pre-flop aggressor out of position. But I want to see what it is. Yeah, man. Either way, I think today's a play day. I'm going to head to the gym.
Now let's discuss.
Yeah. Okay, we're just getting to random things. All right, that's cool. This will be a fun section tomorrow. But, yeah, I'm going to wrap this one up today. And, yeah, we'll come back tomorrow and do that. I'm going to go to the gym, and then I'm going to come back and play, probably be on the game about 3 o'clock. So that's 2.5 hours from now if you're in a different time zone. And I'll see you guys later. Thanks for coming out. Oh, check out the new Jedi Mind Trick. Finished editing it and posted it last night. There's a link right there in chat directly to it. It's a lot of fun. It's a short one, but I really like it. And it's very, it makes me laugh. So I'll see you guys later.